It might be hard to imagine a time when quarterbacks such as Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, and Dak Prescott, all undoubtedly talented starting quarterbacks, wouldn't be given the opportunity to play their position simply because of their skin color. But for a long time, that was the case. Even after pro football ended segregation after the Second World War, black quarterbacks were very scarce, and there wouldn't be a starting black quarterback in one of the pro leagues until 1968. Professional football in America hasn't outlawed black athletes since 1945. In 1946, black players were allowed to play amongst the white players for the second time in the history of the NFL, after limited integration was banned back in 1933. The reason why black athletes were banned in the first place is another story entirely, but essentially some league owners, including George Preston Marshall, who had recently founded the Washington Braves, later the Redskins, campaigned to have them removed. But anyway, pro football became integrated again in 1946, and African-American players had immediate success. Oftentimes, black players led pro football teams in rushing and receiving yards. Most notably, Marion Motley, who was signed by Paul Brown to play for the Cleveland Browns of the AAFC back in 1946, and made an immediate impact, still being considered one of the greatest running backs of all time even today. But even then, neither pro football league had a team which would sign a full-time black starting quarterback. Strictly speaking, the first ever black quarterback to play in the NFL was Fritz Pollard, who quarterbacks the Akron Pros for a short time in 1921. However, the position was vastly different in those days, and the forward pass was essentially outlawed. So the only resemblance between Pollard and the likes of Warren Moon is the fact that they had the same skin color, and they took direct snaps from the center. It's also worth noting that Pollard and his teammate Bobby Marshall were the first two black professional football players in history, and Pollard later became the game's first ever black head coach. Fast forward to post-World War II America, and George Taliaferro became the first African-American to officially play quarterback in the AAFC, which he did in 1949, and he also became the second black quarterback in NFL history when he joined the New York Yanks in 1950. Taliaferro was a jack of all trades. In both 1952 and 53, he accumulated for over 200 passing, rushing, and receiving yards, and he scored a touchdown via all three ways on offense. But despite making 3 Pro Bowls, Taliaferro never led his team in passing, and he was more of a utility player than a quarterback, and therefore not officially a full-time QB. There were a few other black players who dabbled at the quarterback position in the 1950s. Willie Thrower, a member of the Chicago Bears in 1953, threw 8 passes in his career under George Halas. And there was Charlie Choo Choo Brackens of the 1955 Green Bay Packers, who only threw 2 passes. Throughout the 1950s and much of the 1960s, there were plenty of talented black quarterbacks who came through the college rankings, such as Pete Hall, who switched to receiver during his 1 year in the NFL with the New York Giants. But by 1968, there hadn't been a full-time starting black quarterback in the history of pro football. That all changed when a man named Marlin Briscoe broke the color barrier whilst playing for the Denver Broncos of the AFL. Before being selected by the Denver Broncos as a defensive back in the 14th round of the 1968 NFL Draft, Briscoe, a native of Omaha, Nebraska, was a great quarterback for Omaha University. If he couldn't get a tryout, Briscoe informed the squad he would go back to Nebraska and become a school teacher. He was given a shot by Denver, and the 5'10" powerhouse known as the Magician nearly led the Broncos to a win on September 29, 1968 against the Boston Patriots. A week later, on October 6, he received his first historic start. In 1969, Briscoe requested to be released by Denver after they refused to give him an opportunity to compete for the quarterback position again in 1969. Management failed to provide an explanation, just that they decided to go with Pete Linsky as the QB in the future. Linsky didn't last too long in Denver, and the next decent quarterback to play for the Broncos was Charlie Johnson in 1972. Briscoe was essentially forced into the previously mentioned game in September of 1968 against the Boston Patriots due to injuries, and he ended up providing a great deal of excitement for the Broncos faithful for the remainder of that season. After his time in Denver came to an end, he became a special teams ace and a reliable receiver with the Bills and Dolphins, the latter of which he won 2 Super Bowls with, and was a part of Don Shula's perfect 17-0 Dolphins team of 1972. I first learned about Marlin Briscoe when I was a child, and I came across his name watching NFL Films videos, and I didn't completely understand why his skin color was such a big deal at first. But once I got older and I learned about the segregation period and the civil rights movement in the 1960s in the United States, I realized the importance that Briscoe had on the league. An African American playing the most important position in sports, the ultimate leadership role, the position which requires the highest level of intelligence, not only being played, but being played well by a black man, was huge. It should have been a sign that black people are perfectly capable of playing the quarterback position at the professional level. And although it did technically, it wouldn't start seeing black quarterbacks starting in the NFL until the 1980s, when Warren Moon proved his worth after playing in the CFL for 6 years and tearing up the league before becoming a Pro Football Hall of Famer in the NFL. Moon may be the best known example of the quarterback who broke the color barrier in pro football, but the first ever starting black quarterback in the history of pro football, the first one to risk his career and chances of playing in the league in order to play the position and slowly open people's eyes to the fact that the color barrier doesn't have any logic behind it. That was Marlin Briscoe. My favorite quote regarding Marlin Briscoe was one I heard watching NFL films. He was exciting to watch. Whether he was black, white, pink, or blue had nothing to do with it. It was the talent. And I think that was my favourite quote, not just because of what was going on at the time with race relations and the civil rights movement, but just what was going on with the Broncos at the time. At the time, the franchise had never had a winning season, and they had very little to cheer about, so being able to go to Mile High Stadium on Sundays and have a hope of not only seeing some excitement, but maybe even winning, that was huge for the fans. They didn't care about his skin colour, they just cared about how much better he made their team. And that's a logic I'm sure the majority of fans can get behind. Briscoe passed away on June 27th of this year at the age of 76. After learning of Briscoe's unfortunate passing, Denver issued a statement outlining the magician's career and how he became the first black starting quarterback in contemporary professional football. The Broncos stated, "We are heartbroken to learn of the passing of the former Broncos QB Marlin Briscoe. Marlin was a pioneer who shattered barriers, making history as the first black starting quarterback of the Super Bowl era. He paved the way for countless others and created an indelible legacy, including through our Marlin Briscoe Diversity Coaching Fellowship. Our deepest sympathies go out to Marlin's family, friends, and former teammates." Briscoe's brief career as the Broncos starting quarterback will never be forgotten. Although small, he proved that black players could play the quarterback position, and he paved the way for guys like Warren Moon, Randall Cunningham, Steve McNair, Michael Vick, and the great African American quarterbacks of the present.